good afternoon. I think it's good afternoon now. So thank you. I want to talk a little bit about the typology that we're all here to discuss and how that's potentially changing as a typology and how that's going to change our cities. That's my focus, and there's sort of a series of kind of investigations and questions I'll ask, and then I want to get into a few case studies that talk about where we as a company have been pushing the idea of the Synergy Tower, and it's only sort of partway there, and where can it go from here? So that's the kind of focus today. Need the tools. Okay, so a series of questions that we've been asking. So, what if these structures were actually neighborhoods, urban neighborhoods that folded into the sky? What if they were sort of new models of integrated social fabrics, the high-rise structures that we've all been talking about today? What if energy were actually generated from the buildings and their inhabitants? And then these are all questions that I think we all think about, and they all might sort of drive into this new typology. And also, what if they become a laboratory for communication? So these buildings are new sort of tectonic strategies for bringing people together and creating positive communication. I think right now, they're probably not the best laboratories for that right now. What if the future of the high-rise buildings could actually communicate to each other? So it's an organic structure of a city which actually sends information back and forth to each other about how they're operating, how they're functioning. And then what if the materiality of the towers were something different than the sort of the heavy embodied energy of concrete and steel and all those sorts of things, and they were lighter, they're more adaptable and more breathable, like organisms. And I think these are sort of what-if questions, future questions, that then lead to possibilities. And then also, what if they become a grid of shared energy resources? And that also has all sorts of possibilities. And what if they're organic, growing, adaptable, sort of modular pieces that can shrink and grow and change over time, which they really can't right now? So with those questions in mind, as the future of our cities, future of the tall building, we can sort of back up for a second, and everybody's talked about this a bit, but the high-rise. So what about the high-rise? I think the historic high-rise drivers are money and people, right? So there's a city, and the city needs to build a place for people to work, for people to live, for people to meet, all that kind of stuff, to play. And as cities get more dense, and if a city has a real limiter on its growth, like London or San Francisco, those sorts of places, the value of property becomes intense. And then the high-rise building becomes a major economic driver from all aspects. And I think typically, to be cynical, is these are containers for people with some sort of sculptural hat on top or sculptural form to it or something like that. That's what it is. It's a building for a purpose. I think there's sort of three phases of history. And I'm oversimplifying here, of course. You can sort of pick at it a little bit. But the early high rises, which are extruded low buildings, sort of classical low buildings that have been extruded by Beaux-Arts architects. There's the mid-century modern, which is the pure functionalism, meeting sort of sculpture to create this ideal sort of building for developers. And then there's the most recent phase, and you can pick any building you want, but where sculpture becomes a major driver. There's been discussion about icon and about the purpose of that for cities in China or US or wherever to make their mark in the world. And these are all sort of, they're all basically the same container with a different skin around it. And that container becomes disconnected. So there's all this fun stuff that's going on down here. All this energy, activity, people meeting, crossing streets and meeting and having dinner and lunch and roof gardens and all this great stuff that we love about cities. And then there's a line, and I think Jim captured it nicely. There's this great, kind of receptor to the city down here. And the openness that he showed earlier is quite powerful. But everything above it is disconnected from the city. And it's a sort of series of disconnections of these plates that are stacked up that aren't linking back to the city. So that's where those questions started leading to. Do we have to have it this way? Maybe not. So why is this important now? And you've heard some of this from Tim Johnson this morning and others the past few days. So this issue of urbanization, 17,000% increase in urban population since 1800. 1800 is it's a big span of time, but the graphs that Tim showed this morning were quite striking with the switch from rural to urban in countries like China, Korea, and other places. The global population is now more urban than rural since 2009, and the key thing is green space is limited. So as cities, they can either sprawl and eat up more green space and resources, or they can move vertically. And that's the reality of our population growth and the reality of the situation we're in. The idea economy. So, a lot of the most powerful companies in the world are being driven less by sort of manufacturing, but more by ideas. And ideas are creating vast amounts of wealth. If you look at Silicon Valley, the amount of wealth that's been created in Silicon Valley is staggering over the past 20 to 30 years. So there's a need for a new kind of environment of working and living that can continue to stimulate that sort of idea economy. There's this sort of social interaction and communication that's sort of bubbling around us with the amazing network that we're now plugged into, which suggests different ways of living and working, might then suggest different sorts of formation and organization of a vertical building. There's the next generation, which is sort of thinking about the world in different ways and perhaps demanding things that are different. If you look at these companies which I've listed here, average age of these three companies are 26 to 30. And they're driving where things are going, and there's something in there that suggests a different kind of environment. There's obviously the energy and climate. The building sector gobbles up most of our energy in the world. We all know that. And we're making some small strides towards reducing the impact energy on our buildings. We talk a lot about zero carbon and all that kind of stuff. But very few buildings have gotten close to that, but it should just be the norm. So as resources become more and more scarce and as our cities grow, what are we going to do about it? And then buildings can play a major role in that, of course. So we discussed this idea at MEBJ about the high-rise, which I talked about earlier, and then reconceiving it as the synergy tower. And the studies that I'll show you are only part way there, of course. I think there's a vast evolution of this idea that can happen. And you're seeing it in other architects, other firms around the world starting to push this idea. But to reconceive the high-rise as a critical and powerful resource, responding to the environmental, social, and economic challenges, I think that's something interesting that can actually inspire us to do something greater, to limit the growth of our cities horizontally and create some sort of positive vertical. And there's something scary in there too, of course, of this sort of vertical thing, which could be quite not good. But maybe there's something positive. And that's just the question we've been asking. So case studies. And I think the case studies I wanted to show were a thread of an idea that strings across a 15-year period. So there's a lot of opportunity now to test it out in our cities as the real purpose and demand is growing for this idea. But we've been thinking about a way to create structures that basically compel people to communicate with one another and compel people to think about new ideas. And I think that approach is what's driving the idea of the Synergy Tower from our perspective. So this will go kind of from low-rise to high-rise. Low-rise, I'll just show a couple quick examples, but we did a lot of work over the past 15 years to create organisms in low-rise, particularly in office buildings we've been looking at, and some mixed-use projects to allow for this communication to happen. And then we'll take those ideas and move into the high-rise sort of realm. And I show this project, and I'm not going to get into any details here. I'll show this only because we studied this idea in Norway some 10 years ago of creating, well, that doesn't work, so creating a building as a tree structure. So the building, much like the internet or those sort of social media structures I showed earlier, the building can act like that if you engineered it in such a way to create compelling sort of interactions, learning from the city and learning from nature and applying it to, in this case, an office building. So you're pushing people through the trunk, the branches, and out to the leaves. And there's no shortcut in the system as you find in a city or a tree. So taking that idea to compel people to interact. And just imagining what that would be like vertically, but the idea that this becomes a city as a building rather than just a building for people to go to work, but it's actually a place for people to interact, to live, to find new ideas. This is another, which is actually mostly a research facility. And I show this simply because there was an idea of delaminating the program to even further compel people to interact. And researchers are hard folks to kind of get off of their desks or their cubicles or their screens to actually talk to one another. So we created a strategy, which I'll show you developed further in a high-rise, of basically pulling out all of the shared functions out of the building. And the building on the left up there is the new one on the right's the old one. Pulling out, this is in the UK, pulling out all the shared functions and putting them on the other side of a plaza and forcing people from the old building to the new building to cross that plaza to go have lunch, to have a conference, to work out, to simply hang out and to meet. And what it's done, now that the building's in operation, is it has actually created this great sense of community interaction. So I just show those as examples of testing this idea of sort of magnetization and delamination of program to create sort of urban-like interaction. Just a few views of some of these zones in the sort of the seams between those delaminations where that sort of interaction starts to happen. So now taking that idea and moving vertical, and I could talk about other points on the low rises, but to keep things moving along, the vertical. So the vertical city. This is a study we did also maybe 10 years ago, just thinking about the vertical city. We were hired to create a sort of mile-high tower before Adrian's and others have actually been built. And the complexity of getting people up into this sort of structure, the idea of actually creating real plazas and meeting points, it's an interesting idea, but it's a little bit daunting at this scale to think about it as being real humanistic characteristics. So we've tested it out, we've thought it through, but there's a lot of problems with that. So that was a sort of a starting point on the verticality. I want to show this project, which wasn't built. It was for Samsung Electronics, and it was actually a university for them, learning center for their management teams to come and meet and try out new ideas. And the ideas I showed you earlier in the low buildings we used to apply to this building to create a truly interactive vertical university. And the concept was really to say, we were asked to do this. Put some dormitories on the top because they're coming from all over the world to study here. Put the classrooms here and put all the kind of shared stuff here because it's easy and it's logical. And that could work, but you have the same problem. You've just divided everybody up and you've disconnected them vertically and horizontally. So we thought, well, that's a problem. So we took the ideas I showed you earlier, we split this thing apart, delaminated it this way, put the classrooms here, the dormitories there, and we kept the shared functions here, being practical people about getting sort of goods and services and getting lots of people to move through. But then we took some of that stuff and we tossed it back up in between those two pieces. So those become these social magnets, similar to that Welcome Trust project, but now it's vertical. So we've taken things that are all shared by the dormitories and the classrooms, and we've put them at junction points vertically in this tower. And that sort of positive polarization, in theory, because the building wasn't built, in theory, that starts to create some sort of vertical urbanity to the project. And the idea of a vertical campus in a very dense sort of situation where they didn't have the opportunity to go horizontal. This is more of just a quick sort of study on, it's a very beautiful building, a very simple building, on sort of user control and flexible sort of systems. So taking the typical tower, it's just a box, a very beautiful, elegant box for NHN in Korea, the top search engine there. So typically you'd put the core in the middle and all the workplace around there. There's a lot of good reasons for doing that, and we do that a lot. And very simply, we just tried to, and this is done a million times as well, but we tried to move this off to the side, create 5-meter floor-to-floors on every level, and create a very flexible sort of warehouse-like space in the sky. Just testing ideas about flexible, adaptable systems. And that plugs into some of the ideas I talked about earlier. But at a very sort of clean, kind of elementary level here, create beautiful architecture out of it. At the same time, though, creating user control. So the entire facade of the building is wrapped by these green multicolored louvers that allows the programmers and the scripters and all the sort of people who are creating their search engines to control daylight and control the expression of the building. So the expression of the building is talking about the people inside of it. So moving on now to bigger projects. This is a headquarters for CHINATRUST Bank in Taipei. So here we sort of, I think, tentatively push the ideas a little bit further of the sort of delamination and the sort of the polarization of program to create sort of the positive interaction. It's a headquarter, whoops, I did that again. Headquarters tower. These two towers are both part of the headquarters in a hotel and a retail podium at the base. It's on the edge of Taipei, looking back to Taipei 101. It's under construction, as you can see at the base. Conceptually, we tried to create this experience. All these things that we accomplished at the low scale on Telenor and other sorts of projects, trying to fold that up vertically into a series of not just atriums for the sake of an atrium with some trees and some nice sky lobby situations, but actually these series of pocket parks almost that have cafes, that have meeting facilities, that have lobbies, that have different things. And we broke them into smaller chunks. But we just started to tentatively delaminate the building to create that kind of experience. And you can see here in the plan, taking the typical tower, splitting it, cracking it open, and then creating these zones in those interstitial spaces that become those vertical plazas. And they have meeting spaces, lobbies, some shared functions, and then all the offices are here looking into them. Key point, visual and physical communication, but also real program activity happening in there. So that's sort of the idea of the CHINATRUST project. Taking it a step, because blowing the whole thing open is a little bit hard on some of these projects. A view of the project. This should be done sometime in the next year or so. They've topped off the steel. The skin is starting to go on it. And then one other sort of project is the Korean Telecom. This one is not being built, but this is the headquarters for KT that we competed for. And we took the idea that I outlined in CHINATRUST, and we took it, so rather than stacking a series of these spaces, we started to create an unwound street that goes up through the entire building. Again, to promote visual and physical communication and to force some sort of overlap of people to actually trade ideas, think about things differently, and get people out of their seats and into a urban environment. And the challenge with all these things I'm showing you is, I think where we still lack the real connection is, there's still all the fun stuff happening here. We're trying to deconstruct the tower within to open up the vertical communication and sort of the urban conditions. But how do we put those two things together? That's still, the big question. Here, at any rate, here you can see this idea of this sort of street, which starts to go up through the entire building on each side of it as we sort of pull apart and delaminate the two structures. And the kind of character that creates, allowing sort of maximum visual connection from the workplace back into these sort of plazas and these steps and stairs and spaces and auditoriums that go up through the building. So with that, we were able to take those ideas and bring them to the next level on the TENCENT headquarters. And still, one step down the road, there's probably 20, 30 to go on this idea. But this was an opportunity to create truly and build truly a vertical campus / city for TENCENT. And I'd really say campus because it's for them. It's not yet for the city, so that's the next step. But this is, it's a 54-story tower on one side, 48-story tower on the other side. And it's headquarters for TENCENT. So for those who don't know, that's the third largest internet company in the world, behind Microsoft and Amazon. So that's pretty staggering, but it's all within doing business mostly within China, because the market in China is huge. It's a very young company. It's growing like crazy. They They do everything on the internet from blogging and instant messaging to games to all those sorts of things. So it's about this new generation. It's about the information economy. It's about all of those things I talked about earlier, which is interesting. And to capture the energy of Tencent, and for those who know Tencent, probably everybody here who's from China has a QQ account, I suspect. And to capture that energy into the building was our first challenge. And to understand that the people inside the building are making products and services for the people in China are the same people, which is interesting. They're all about 30 years old at the most. So to understand the people that are going to be inside the building, and how does that sort of reflect in a strategy for reforming the tower. And there's a lot of images, like this is their mascot and the mascot's girlfriend, I suppose. And this idea of communication and connectivity, which is what their business is about, but also can we then reflect that somehow in the tower? Can we create some sort of tower which is taking the ideas I talked about earlier, rethinking the vertical proposition, and basically being all about communication in all directions. So not communication just like this, but starting to become almost like a cloud communication. The site is in Shenzhen, for those who know, one of the largest, fastest growing cities in the world. They had a massive FAR, which allowed for 7,000 square meters per floor plate chunked up on this site. That seemed a little bit dramatic and massive. So using the inspiration of Tencent and connectivity, we split the mass into two pieces. And at the same time examining the site, because we wanted to take a strategy which says, because the technology for reducing energy is still very expensive, we wanted to make sure we do everything with the building we can to reduce the impact of the sun and the wind and other sorts of things, and reduce the energy consumption. We had a 30% reduction goal on this one. So we faced these two masses south, lifted up the south tower to shade the north tower, and reduce as much as possible of the south, east, and west. The east and west is the narrow, the south is the broad. And then we opened it up to capture the prevailing winds. So we did several key steps to accomplish that goal just with the massing. And that played a huge role in reducing energy consumption in the project. And then by splitting them open, you start creating this visual communication I talked about. So everybody in the building, in tower, north tower and south tower, can see each other, and they can connect to each other. So then how do we connect them? So if they want to see each other, but then we really need to bring them together. The program called for a whole bunch of pretty extensive stuff that they want to have as amenities for their employees. Cultural things, health and fitness things, and knowledge-related things. So we split this tower. We've still got all these things at the bottom. We could put some little tentative bridges like we had in CHINATRUST, which are nice, but they're not really meaningful, really, frankly. So we took all that program and we pushed it up into the tower, into these three bridges. Those three bridges have real purpose in that they are the shared functions that bind the company together. And they create real sort of urban spaces, urban meaning within a campus context in the tower. And it also allows the opportunity to change movement from being purely vertical to movement to suddenly being cloud-like. So you can start moving through this tower in any way that you sort of please. Now, to do that, of course, we have to engineer it quite carefully, but the effect is this vertical campus idea, taking the campus and moving it upwards. In Shenzhen, land is expensive. Tencent had no way of doing a real campus, which is what they wanted to do. So we created a real vertical campus for them. And these three links, this culture link, which has all of the sort of the dining facilities, the Tencent Museum, the expo, the auditorium, some of which are shared and used by the outside of the city, and some of which is used just by the employees. So this is the cultural link. The health link has a full-scale basketball court, fitness center, and all those sorts of things in the middle. And then the knowledge link has Tencent University, meeting rooms, library, and those kind of things. We had to engineer a vertical transportation system which takes advantage of these links to allow people to quickly get up into the building, but also allow people the opportunity to stop, cross over, meet people from the north tower, go up to the top, circle back down again on the other tower. So it becomes a subway map in a way. And I think Raphael Vignoli talked about that yesterday, the idea of the subway becoming the vertical subway. And this is, I think, an opportunity to start testing that idea and seeing if we can make it happen. Obviously, the configuration each time one of these links ties into these office buildings changes kind of the condition and changes based on program and function as well. And as you go up from the lobby, you can see puncturing through that first culture link above you and looking out to the city. So you understand the TENCENT campus above you, and you understand your connection to the city beyond. The museum for TENCENT. Going up to the middle, which is the health, the sort of the heart of the tower, is this basketball club surrounded by all sorts of fitness activities. And at the very top is this, the reading room, the library, the campus, the sort of knowledge center for the whole thing at the top of the tower. It's calmer, it's quieter, it's a place for measured interaction in meetings and in knowledge sharing. And then the typical offices, we tried to also puncture these sort of plates, these endless plates, and we tried to puncture them throughout the office buildings with a series of connected stairs with a series of 3-story spaces which link the whole tower together, and allowing different groups to talk to each other visually and physically, as I talked about earlier. Some of the spaces are more elaborate, and they utilize the view to the outside. Some of them are more in bed and focused, and sort of the character of the space. So one last point. I know my time is up based on that last card. So when we move back outside, these links that we call them, these 3 links that tie these 2 towers together, we also, the self-shading on the masses was then taken to the skin itself. So the skin, which represents this sort of idea of this cloud, this sort of cloud of information, which is wrapping around these 2 towers, is actually doing something to further self-shade the building. So in the south, all these sawtooths are leaning out, blocking the sun. On the east and the west, they're all tilting this way and that way to block the sun. Actually, the north too, because the sun curls around to the north side. So those measures express the power of the tower, but they also start to reduce the energy consumption. We got pretty close to our target with those major massing and skin moves that we made. And then we expressed the idea of the vertical campus. So that's what I have. I think there's obviously a long way to go with this idea, and it's full of a lot of potential. It could be, as I said, something scary or something very powerful and positive for humanity. So I think that's the debate to have. Thank you.